Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to this session where we are going to talk about the ways to go over, as it says, extinction of independent media. But let me first introduce myself and my panelists. My name is Milica Pešić. I am Executive Director of Media Diversity Institute, which is London-based British organization specialized in, bringing diversity to the media. We work with media, conventional and social media. We work with civil society organizations, and we work with media educators, particularly through our MA course, which we have in London together with the Westminster University. I'll now introduce my panelists. On my right is Sharon Moshavi, who I want to congratulate because since I last time saw Sharon, she became the president of the International Center for Journalists in Washington, and it's lovely to have another woman running the show, so we hope that one day we'll be majority. Sharon has been leading for years in the center all kinds of very innovative researches, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted Sharon to be with us today, to see what we are talking from this innovative kind of ways, because we are all searching for the answers to the questions everyone is posing, but very little answers. On my left is someone most of you here know, Peter Pomerantsev, who I met when I read his fantastic book, Everything is Possible, Nothing is True, and it's about Kremlin propaganda, and I thought I have to meet this person because I come from Serbia, where I used to work on national television before our war started, and then the television was taken by the government and turned into propagandist machinery. So what I read in Peter's book was exactly what we were going through and what media are now going through again and again, due to this new war in Ukraine. And on my far left is my friend for years, Jovanka Matic, who is a media expert from Belgrade, who's done a lot of research for different international organizations on media, of audience, and we'll be talking about the whole region from the point of this very topic. And finally, I hope you will see him. He's with us online, Hossein Taranshan. Hello, Hossein. Are you moving? We can't see you moving. It's frozen. Hossein, unfortunately, could not be with us. Hossein is a Canadian writer and researcher of Iranian background. He was known in Iran as the father of blog, and that's where he was criticizing Iranian authorities. That's why he ended in prison for 6 years, and after he was out from the prison, he went to Canada, became Canadian citizen, but because of his prison history in Iran, he's been constantly having an issue with his passport. He applied for a new passport because the current one was expiring in November. He applied in July last year, and he hasn't got it yet. And Canada is one of the two countries, along with Britain, which came with this idea of this international public interest media fund in 2019, and we are talking about this fund today, unfortunately with Hossein being only online with us. But Hossein, I hope you hear us and you will be with us all through this discussion. So now just to introduce the topic, and then I'll let my panelists talk. If you read on the website, and I'm sure you did because you wouldn't be here, but this $30 billion we are constantly talking about, which conventional media lost in 2020 alone, is something that everyone is really worried about and with. And then when you know that during the COVID, many were struggling, media in particular, being under the pressure of their governments, being unable to reach what is called unnewsed, part of the public really totally ignored by conventional media. And then, we heard on 9th of December that at this Democracy Forum in Washington that President Biden would put this initial seed money, $30 million in this fund. So we thought it's time maybe to talk about, what actually this fund will be about, and then how much through this fund, this public interest media would really reach different segments of society. One of the things we learned about the fund is that, they did the research and fragmentation of the audience, lack of trust in the media. So this will be the topics, but the main topic is, where is diversity in all this? Are these public interest media really going to give a voice for those who've been marginalized by conventional media? How they're going to do it? And I'll start with the good news. If you didn't go to the session about the very fund, they announced today that in May there will be very first call for applications from public interest media in different parts of the world. They were not quite sure which regions, but I think definitely it would be Russia and Ukraine, Eastern Europe, Latin America. And they mentioned once in 1 hour word diversity, but primarily to say that, they will be taking care of geographic diversity. So I'll start with Sharon, because you've done so much studies and, about the trust. Where is the trust and how we can really build this trust, and maybe one good news from the times of COVID, that people realize that we really need trustworthy media to deal with the pandemic. So Sharon, the floor is yours.
Well, I think I felt that way. I'm not sure, unfortunately, everybody did, but a lot of people. Trust and trustworthiness is something that I think a lot about, and that I think is really important to journalism. It goes to the sustainability piece at the very basic level. If nobody trusts you, if you're not considered trustworthy, no one's going to pay for your content. So it is a deep connection, I think, to the financial sustainability of the industry as well. But what I want to posit is that, this is something, we see it all over the world. People declining trust in institutions, in government, in business, in media. And media is among the worst. And what do we do about that? And I think as journalists, a lot of people, we wring our hands justifiably at the political polarization that we see pretty much everywhere. That sadly is a global trend. Propaganda, state propaganda, state disinformation as well. And also the platforms, right? We see disinformation just spreading on it, and we know that is leading to a decline in the trust of our content. But I think we have to, as in the journalism space, think about this from, okay, what can we do? And not just wring our hands and say, well, we're just going to put our heads down and do our jobs. I do think we need sort of a real call to action around creating trustworthy journalism. And I do really think it's an ecosystem problem that needs to be dealt with at the ecosystem level. And I would posit, and there's lots of great innovations around these areas. But what I think is missing is, again, looking at this from an ecosystem level. And how do you create trust in every level, and think about trust from the perspective of a news organization, from every part of the news process: editing, reporting, distribution, and marketing. There is something to be said at each of these levels. On the reporting piece, for example, diversity is a key piece. Are we reflecting the communities out there? Are you getting community input in your stories? That is a very key piece, I think, into building trust. There is also disinformation, and I think we talk a lot about combating disinformation, but to me, some of the most successful models are people who are covering disinformation. Instead of playing whack-a-mole, fact-checking all the time, helping people understand and saying, where's this money coming from? Who's behind this and how much money they have? That kind of investigative work, I think, is really a key to building up that trust. Another piece on the reporting thing I would say is contextualizing stories. What is it, what does that story mean for me as your audience? Why should I care? And thinking about all of these things when we start to build our stories. The same thing goes at the editing place, opinion versus news, tagging that correctly. There are numerous trust indicators, great projects like the Trust Project, which are trying to do that. One of those indicators that apparently research has shown gets a lot of attention is people understanding why you did a particular story. Were you just trying to attack somebody? Was there a reason behind going after the story? Conveying the impact of the story and the journalism that you do. That is another way that builds trust. On the marketing side, a lot of the language that we all love and use about journalism, accountability, watchdog, holding the powerful to account, doesn't resonate with a lot of audiences. A lot of research has shown it immediately, in a lot of people's mind, sets up journalism as confrontational, as oppositionist, as, oh, you have an agenda. So that's simply how we talk about it to the outside world. And then there's distribution, which I think is probably the biggest challenge, because obviously social media platforms has sucked up distribution. And we know, again, from lots of research, that when you see a piece of news content on a social media platform, you're less likely to trust it. So this is the hardest piece, but there are consortia that can be formed to widen distribution. You can create consortia between news organizations and public and social media influencers. One Swiss, I think it's Swiss group of large publishers in Switzerland, for example, has a common login, so you can access it. So if you put all of these things together, each piecemeal is great, lots of people doing it. But what I think we really need is to look at this all holistically and make that a real centerpiece of the journalistic enterprise. So I will stop there.
Right, moment to get Peter, who is, I forgot to mention that Peter is now with Johns Hopkins University, Agora Institute, where you are doing research of the audience, so where you are with the trust issue.
So I'm coming at this problem not from the ecosystem side, but really from the side of complete despair, which first working in Russia as a documentary maker and a TV producer, then coming back to Brexit Britain, and now working in the US, finding that all the cliches that I had in my head about winning trust from audiences or gaining their trust or earning their trust were simply false. That the facts were not getting through, that all my skills as a storyteller were completely hitting a wall of conspiratorial thinking, distrust, and ultimately, for me, despair, because I'm lying to myself if I think I'm doing anything worthwhile, if I'm writing pieces for The Atlantic to people just like me, which I do, but I know that I'm not changing anything. And I think we have to confront that. The research center that I helped set up first at the LSE and now at Hopkins is a tiny, tiny, tiny little cell that looks at how do we reach audiences that don't trust us. I think we are seeing overall falling trust, but we're also seeing the politicization of trust, where people will trust their media and not trust the other one. Media was sadly always about identity, but now it's just become about identity. And that's terrible if you believe in any kind of, however vague, notion of a public sphere, which is really what I hope we get into today. What do we mean by public, and what do we mean by a public sphere, and what's our role within it? So, look, we do very practical things. You know, we've done research about, in Ukraine, we did a hell of a lot of research in Ukraine, and really, I think the Kremlin, if it had half a brain, should have been reading our research, because if they'd read it, they'd realize that their plan on destroying Ukraine would not work. Because we found that beneath these kind of conspiratorial, distrusting bubbles around ethnic identity or linguistic identity, or around historical identity, which is something we looked at a lot, there was a way to talk about the most sensitive and difficult historical issues, which in Ukraine are often about the Second World War and nostalgia for the Soviet Union. If you really start to understand the audience, if you stop thinking about them in the cliches of liberal or conservative audience, or pro-Soviet or anti-Soviet, if you start to really understand their experiences with something like the Soviet Union, we even found that people who are Soviet nostalgics on the polling level, if you poll them, they say, we're nostalgic for the Soviet Union. That's what the Kremlin was looking at. They were like, oh my God, everybody in Eastern Ukraine is nostalgic for the Soviet Union. They're going to love us when we invade. If you start digging into it, you'll find nuance, you'll find contradiction, you'll find people are open to all sorts of often suppressed and traumatized experiences, which, I don't know, in the context that I work in are, most famously talked about by Svetlana Alexievich, who's a Nobel Prize-winning author who does just that. She talks about repressed memory. But we were trying to do this for a mass audience. So I can go into the details, but it's all about listening and finding those connections. And that can be done with so many tools these days. It's about respecting the audience, and then you can find a common language. And we're trying to do similar work in the US now, again on the historical topic. And again, trying to throw out these cliches about the North versus the South. Put away our stereotypes and our fears about some attitudes which show up in polling, but when you probe them, are again much, much more nuanced. So that's what we do. I can't say we have complete success, but I do think we need this whole vector of movements in media. I think we need a piece of the media, not all of it, but a piece of the media that gets up in the morning thinking, how do we get the facts across to audiences who are in a separate reality bubble, essentially. And that's a job. And that means someone has to pay for it. And the incentives, as we all know from the ad tech industry, are on exactly the opposite. And I think we've actually, something we need to face up as a sector, and the sort of donor sector, is have we been partly responsible? When we tell a little media in Ukraine, I want you to be sustainable within 1 year, or else the funding goes, which some funders do. And the little media goes, well, there's only one way for me to become sustainable. Polarize, 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 polarize. And that's meant to be good. So we have a real incentive problem, because I think journalists get this. I think we're all clever enough to understand this challenge, but there is zero incentive to do it, and that really worries me.
This was really pessimistic, but Jovanka...
Can I just say I'm Ukrainian? This is my natural mode.
Well, we always talk about Slavic mentality. As my friend from Boston asked me, do your Serbs cry as much as Russians? So, Jovanka, what's the Balkan story? Where is the trust there?
It's also a very pessimistic story, unfortunately. I come from the region, the Western Balkans, which includes Serbia, Bosnia, Macedonia, Montenegro, Kosovo, Albania. I hope you heard of these countries, where we still deal with media issues that were relevant in the last century, not today. The problem with these countries is that they are all new democracies, or let's call them post-Berlin Wall democracies. In fact, they are very weak democracies, in scientific terms, non-consolidated democracies, but in reality terms, they are stabilitocracies, where the European Union promoted only stability as the main characteristic of the regime, and didn't care how the democracy developed inside the countries, giving them hope that one day they will become members of the European Union. The problem with media there is that there is a very strong polarization among media as pro-government and independent, and the audience are also polarized. So there is a big part of the audience that trusts only the government-controlled media, and there is a small part of the audience that trusts only the independent media. The problem is that these independent media are very few, with very limited reach of the audience and very financially unstable, and they cannot increase their influence. First of all, because they are under constant pressure of the government. The government continuously tries to stop their development and labels them as politically partial because of their access to political alternatives, because of their diversity, giving voices to all parts of the society, and calls them traitors and non-patriotic actors and people who accept foreign money to work against the interest of the native people. The public, we have a very strong experience of public interest media. I hope you have all heard of B92 radio and television, which used to be a flagship of public interest media in the whole region, but which was very well held by donors' money, but it collapsed the moment it entered the market. So the problem that we have now is that will the media survive without this financial viability? Could the foreign donor money help them to survive, or will even diminish the trust in the remaining media that somehow succeed to survive?
Thanks, Jovanka. Let me bring Hossein. Hossein, you've heard Peter mentioning bubbles, and in your research on what you call personalization of truth, you are actually talking about bubbles as not being the right thing. Can you elaborate on that? Do you have PowerPoint presentation? I'm not sure what's happening.
Yeah, can you hear me first?
Yeah, can you hear me first?
Yeah, probably. Yeah. I do have something I can share. If it doesn't matter. I mean, it would help. It helps the theory of trust in public. Hello, I can't hear you.
Shall we try once more and then we'll decide?
Sure. Yes. Yes, I think you can see.
So let's not give up. We'll go to Sharon, but if you manage, we can go back to Hossein. Sharon.
I just want.
I'm back. I'm
really
back.
sad. I am not. Nobody who knows me would ever accuse me of optimism. Just so you know. So I'm going to play a very unconventional role for myself. I guess I'm in the school of we have to try, to your point about there are the persuadable, to your point, Peter, right? Figuring out who they are and how to do it. And it's not only about money. Again, I can't believe I'm saying that either, because we all know how much journalism needs financial support. But I do think there is a mentality that I think we are all used to. It's ingrained in the journalistic ethos. It's the mission for why a lot of us people do what they do, but I don't think it always works. And we got to try, as you said, we have to try things, right? And so I think it's important to still try to get funding for the kinds of things you're talking about, do the research, get the platforms to do their thing. But I do think we need to be, this is where innovation, I think, comes in, is what can we try and what can we experiment with? And I think, to your point, because of the lack of funding as well, there's very little room for experimentation. And that I feel like is where you do need financial support as well in terms of experimenting. What can work for those persuadable folks. We're not going to get the total. I was going to use the word crazies. I guess I should not. But there is that middle somewhere, and I think that is our duty to try what we can to find it.
I think Peter is not that much pessimist. He's just impatient. So Peter,
because we have so much time on our side. I mean,
solutions.
God, like Le Pen is going to maybe win next week. Trump might well get back in a few years' time, and Russia might well win this war. I mean, don't think we have much time.
The Buddhists would say after the rain or after the conflict, something positive should.
So
what do you do?
Well, look, we have to go, look, there's going to be different, so if we agree that we need sort of almost like a new movement within media that's dealing with some of these issues, let's call them around trust, because you're right. When we try to measure this stuff in both quant and qual, we're looking for trust metrics, which get very sophisticated. But, I mean, we never ask the question, do you trust? But it's around trust. It's around, do you feel that the media is on your side, that they're listening to you? That whole bundle of stuff that we package around trust. So if we get this trust-orientated media, I think it'll be different things in different countries. I think in America, if you say the word public, you will lose because of America's history. I have recently started talking about a flotilla of civic media, a Tocquevillian image of media, and then American funders are like, oh yeah, no, Tocqueville, yeah, that's good, yeah, that's us. It's the same thing. But you talk about civic media. There is this bill about local media, which is really encouraging. I just don't think it's like local media, which is a good thing and needs to be supported, a really good first step. But what is this local media doing is sort of the question. It can just polarize within the community. So that's one step. So I think in America it will be a mixture of sort of like positive regulation and maybe the sort of larger vision of civic media. The other piece, which I think is realistic, is regulation around tech. And what is tech's role in furthering the ecosystem? We have some suspicions about what its role is based on the amount of evidence we can see. The problem is we can't really see the evidence. So I think the EU's movement towards regulating technology, which I hope can be done in a very constructive way, in a way that sort of gets into a productive conversation with the tech companies about what is good for democracy, which is very hard to define. It's not easy. That's a step in the right direction. I think in terms of funding, Ethan Zuckerman's, who's a professor at Amherst, idea about taking some of the money from the surveillance capitalism giants and putting them towards civic tech, because this is a tech issue as well. How do you create platforms that further a trusting community, and how do you create content that does that? So taking some of their money and giving it, that could be a possible solution. All of this is hard. It's bloody hard to define what is good for democracy. We've sat in these meetings and they're pretty dispiriting. But we've got to start moving towards that. So I think there are very practical steps that can be done. Again, I think the EU regulation is a good step forward. I think there is now an understanding among sort of donors, academic elites, that there is a challenge we need to fix. So we're in a much better place than we were in 2016 when this conversation exploded. So we are making progress, but you're right, I am impatient.
But you are a bit optimistic. Jovanka, local media, you did a recently study about local media. Are they the way to give a voice to those who are ignored by conventional media?
Unfortunately, they have very few resources, and the complete ecosystem doesn't support their active role. I would say I see solutions in two changes. One is the changing this paradigm of media. Somebody was mentioning today, new paradigm of journalism, in educating the audiences to accept this new concept of public interest media. We have our audiences in our region accepted as a new concept the public service media. That was a very novel thing in the 1990s. And it was accepted with a big hope that finally we shall step over the state propaganda. In all the countries of the region, there are developed public service media, but they all work in favor of these populist governments which are in power. So this term is now discredited. And even public service media are more professional, more diverse, more successful, and more trusted than commercial media, which are very widespread. Still, they don't attract a lot of credibility. So this new concept of public service media, I think, will give new hope to audiences, and public interest media will give audiences a hope that something new can be achieved in this environment. Another solution lays with the audience, with not news consumers, but news users. Our audiences are used to be passive consumers who accept whatever is given to them. Serbia, for example, is top of the world in the length of TV watching. It's about 5 or 6 hours a day. People are not very rich, and it's the cheapest entertainment they can get is to sit in front of TV screen and watch whatever they are offered. So we need in audiences a new attitude, people who will actively seek the news and choose the news, but who will be literate enough to know what sources are credible and how journalism is done, and why different media present different pictures of reality, and will know who to trust and how to accept the news. And the hope there lies with digital media, which are on big rise in Serbia, but are very low in resources. So I hope that the audience will come to understanding that they have actively to help the production of this new digital media that they rely on. They cannot get the news free because journalism is a profession, production of news is expensive, and they will have to participate in some ways in production of this public good when they recognize it.
Thanks, Jovanka. Shall we try again with Hossein?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? I can hear. I mean, it wakes people up. It's after lunch. So.
Unfortunately, we can try again. I really want some optimism here, so let's hope that in an EU country internet works. Sharon, shall we go back to diversity? Because my obsession.
Sure.
Can this public interest media really reflect diversity, which does exist in every society? And I don't mean only ethnicity, religion, race, I mean gender, I mean age, I mean physical, mental abilities. People are different.
I think it can, and I think it's important to. And here I'll play the pessimist for a moment. I have less optimism in audiences than you. I think the people, when we talk about who we want to reach, are the people who don't choose the news, who don't care or know how journalism is done. I have friends of mine who've known me for years, still, and I've talked about journalism, don't understand. It is a hard thing to do. But I think one of the things that can help is that diversity, and that diversity can take place in a number of ways. One of which is local. Local is, right, you have it, it's in your community. You see a journalist. Somebody told me about someone they saw speaking, and I can't remember who it was, who made the important point that most people don't know a journalist. And if you don't, it's like anything, if you can't humanize it. So local, I think, is important in that way, because you have journalists in where you live. You start seeing them. And then if they're reflecting that community, then they seem that they are part of you as well. So I do think that's really important in terms of it, because that reflecting that you are not the other, you are not elite, do not have a bias, an agenda that is completely devoid of my beliefs. I think that diversity is incredibly, incredibly important. And here's where I am a bit optimistic, because what you are seeing, which is good, again, with a lot of challenges there, a lot of journalism entrepreneurs, and we're seeing that literally all across the world. Journalists, trying to start something local, and it's hard. The money, the business sense is really lacking. But the more you have these small and hopefully financially sustainable outlets of a woman starting an environmental site in her neighborhood, in her community in Africa, I know in the Congo, for example. There's a great site we've helped support in India that is covering the tribal community. Those kinds of things, you start to see yourself reflected as well. So I do think that, and again, it feels like everything does come back to money a lot, because of those kinds of very small organizations, and they are by definition diverse and reflective of communities. The more you have those, I do think that goes towards building that audience trust, building that engagement with communities, and trying to start to fix some of the problems that we're talking about. Again, not quickly, Peter, but...
Peter, you mentioned identity as I felt in some kind of negative tone, and then I'd like you to elaborate a bit more, because we are talking now about identity politics as something which is not anymore as acceptable and positive as it used to be.
Yeah, and you have to be very contextual about that and how you're using it. I think it's funny, like on Monday I've got to teach a class to my students to write about this. I completely agree about diversity, or I kind of like this old world pluralism. I've always been very fond of it. And we think about that a lot. I just want to sort of add some sort of like nuance to it and complexity. How do we decide what are the diverse identities that we want? There's a real danger, and we do a lot of sort of sociologically based stuff, and I'm very aware of the trap that you end up defining people as the liberal, the conservative, the demographic, when actually what we almost want is to get beyond these cliches. Firstly, these cliches are often created by political contexts and by, I'm going to use this very old-fashioned word, propaganda, though I know it's a complicated word. So we have to. It's so important to do that social research and think about what pluralism, diversity means. But you almost want to be undermining yourself as you do it and constantly breaking the cliches, because somebody else is trying to create those and manipulate those. And I think in order to do that, we have to think about this word identity a little bit, because we usually, again, you talk about it in a very static way. For example, in someone I like very much, Daniel Kahan, who's at Yale, he has this cultural cognition project, which shows that, like, if you have a certain cultural identity, the way he defines it, you have all these biases. For example, he's shown that, people who are very religious reject climate change, or young white males ignore the facts around the connection between not wearing a seatbelt and car crashes, because it's not part of their cultural identity to put on a seatbelt. So but him, and generally we treat identity as very static. And so I always get one of my favorite psychoanalysts, who's a literature professor and a psychoanalyst in London, Josh Cohen, to come and talk to my students about how he thinks about identity in clinical practice. And I'm really grotesquely, crunching what he says, but this is the way I understand it as someone who doesn't really understand psychoanalysis. He says he approaches the term identity in a very careful and often negative way for the following reason. And putting it in the context of a child growing up, when children grow up and can't deal with reality for many, many reasons, they tend to take on these very aggressive identities. So he's always worried about identity becoming something aggressive that's based on fear and paranoia, for his context, losing the mother, but you can think about it in cultural or social ways as well. It's based on, hating on someone else. And so he always tries to get his patients to think about identification, something which is open-ended, hyphenated, which lets new ideas into itself. So I'm certainly not against identity politics as in defending the rights of minorities who've been oppressed for centuries. That's really important. I'm not talking about rights and identity. That's necessary and the aim of much of democracy, I hope. I'm talking about being very careful in the way we tell stories. And I'm not from a news background. I'm from documentary making and TV shows background. And creating stories and formats and ways of talking about identity which has this sort of open-ended, open, and I suppose really much more democratic idea of identity per se. So that's where the nuance comes in, I think. But I do think diversity and pluralism are the buzzwords. But it gets interesting when we start to sort of really plow into those ideas.
But the way BBC is one of the most famous public service media deal with diversity, they look at the demographics and try to reflect that demographics in the content as well as in human resources. Will this public interest media do something similar? How they are going to answer the question of, fragmentation and, marginalized communities?
I don't know. I mean, I think, to your point, I think it is conventional demographics to a large extent. And that has its good points. As Peter said, there are marginalized communities that have not had a voice, have not had a seat at the table, and that is really important. But if you look at everything through the lens, and I think your idea is really interesting, Peter, and that research about sort of the cross pollination, people have multiple identities, is important. So I think it's important as well that we look at not just sort of those demographics, but ideas as well, and that's where groupthink has become an incredibly, I think, dangerous bubble. We all live in our bubbles at this point, and breaking out of those bubbles, I think, is something that has to be very intentional. I don't think simply by saying, okay, we have demographically supported enough media in XXX, that is going to do it. I think there has to be an intentional effort when we think about pluralism and diversity to think about it in the bubble sense as well. What is going to get me out of it? And the other point I want to make is I think the danger constantly with identity politics is that people mostly at this point define themselves by what they hate. There was a columnist in the U.S. who early on predicted Donald Trump would win, and he said because, quote, he hates all the right people. And that seems to matter more than anything in terms of identity, that you hate the right people. And so I think we need to be thinking not just the where identity is good, but thinking about that sort of inverse, the hate, and how you can do in storytelling and in formats and in who has the microphone and who owns the outlet, to think about it from that perspective too. I think it's incredibly important to be aware about.
Several years ago, European Commission did a study, Business Case for Diversity, where they tried to establish a link between diversifying the production forces or the newsroom in case of the media, and then the product that automatically diversifies. But they couldn't establish the equity, the line that directly. Really? Does that bring more profit? Does that, in case of commercial media, does it bring more credibility? No one is doing that kind of studies anymore. We try to talk to the European Commission to let us do it, but is this the problem? Is this the reason why media are not trying to be more inclusive of different categories of diversity? Who wants to answer that question? And we'll check once more then with our Hossein, poor guy sitting there waiting.
I'm not sure I know the answer to that. It's hard to say why not. I do think there is a gap between, there's amazing research that's going on. I mean, we're missing it in key areas, but it is. And it's often very separated from the practice. And so how do you get those together so that we are doing more action research? And that's something that ICFJ we are trying to do. We have a research arm now too. And how do you sort of take these things, and again, it goes back to experimentation. How do you find things out in the research like that and then have a way to sort of immediately to impatient Peter over there, immediately try to put it into practice and try to see, hey, is this a possible solution? Is there something here? And that I think that is something that needs to be done, because marrying those two pieces together.
Peter, you did some study a couple of years ago about the audience in Russia, if I remember well. And, then we did this project about infotainment. And so my question to you is actually, is infotainment inclusive of diversity maybe an answer how to bring different audience in? Your study was very interesting, if I remember well, though it was not a public study.
Well, I mean, there's lots of studies. I mean, there's, and also there's internal research by USAGM, the sort of, the American body that looks at sort of funds Radio Free Europe is constantly doing studies. So there's many studies. Ours was one of many. But I don't really know what the term infotainment means, to be honest.
Infotainment then, because your study was about,
it was about
what's the best way for the audience in Russia to get the information they are not interested in.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's often that way. I don't think it's about Russia. I think at the moment there's very, very interesting research in America about where people get their information about, the world. And increasingly they get it through kind of YouTube comedians. I mean, we already had that movement with like Steve Colbert, but that was an elite one. That was sort of like, but now people are like, especially young people, they're not watching the news, but they're watching these YouTube comedians, and that's where they're getting their information. So we're thinking a lot about how do you talk about American history in ways that will, both face up to the facts, but also bring a broad coalition of audiences together. And we're kind of thinking, okay, we're doing the social research now. And then, okay, but who do we give this social research to? So we could give it to the History Channel, who will do their big, here is American history documentary. And that's fine. But I'm like, how do we start talking to these YouTube comedians? I don't even know their names. I mean, like, this is a whole world that I barely knew until someone showed me the research. So you'd want to engage them. The news broadcasters might not well be the defining vector. So we really have to understand where people are getting their information from. They're not just getting entertainment, they're getting information from these people about the world. So we have to be very, very broad-minded, I think.
Just to add to that, we did an interesting project in Nigeria that did just that. It was around COVID misinformation, and it brought together journalism, news organizations, fact-checking groups, and social media influencers. We had sort of a group of 17 or 20 with very disparate audiences, really large audiences, created a lot of humor videos, and it was sort of putting that infotainment together and finding audiences where they live. And it goes back to, I guess, what I said before about, trying to reach people who don't necessarily choose the news, but they are getting their information somewhere and finding them where they are in ways that speak to them. I do think humor is interesting. It is, though, polarizing. I mean, in the U.S., right, we have, the ones that are the most well-known, and my daughter watches the YouTube ones too, so that's how I know about that. It also is polarizing. It tend to be, on the left side of things. So I don't know how you use humor in a way that, again, pierces those bubbles. One thing you and I talked about last night, though, is darkness and speaking to, Slavic darkness. People, it is a way to sort of penetrate with the truth, because people, I think the world over do respond to dark humor. And how do you sort of cover the really bad stuff? And if you inject it with humor, that does become, in a lot of ways, more universal. So I think that is an interesting direction.
I would say that in the Balkan region, humor is very important, and it doesn't show only on YouTube. It is shown on cable television, on the channels which are most popular for their news programs, and that proved to be a very good combination. Because for especially young audiences, these humoristic programs become the primary news programs, source of information. We have very good comedians who appear almost on a daily basis on cable channels and talk about everyday news. and they are very attractive to young audiences and bring all those perspectives that you cannot find on mainstream media. So that proved to be a very good source of information, but not very good stimulator of practical action to stimulate people, for example, to go to protests, because you get satisfaction from just hearing different opinions and government being ridiculed, and you don't feel any need to do anything more. An interesting phenomenon concerning diversity in the Balkan media is that reality programs are very popular. And these reality shows that last almost all day in several very commercialized TV stations with national frequencies, they bring a lot of different people in their programs and in their studios. And this is something that is very interesting to people because they can see ordinary people there doing everyday stuff. So in that way, people are introduced to seeing different people from different backgrounds, different educational layers, different professions. So you see that there is a need for looking at diversity of the population. But concerning the news, this audience is not interested to hear diverse opinions. So there is a big contradiction there, and that's how commercial media preserve their audiences with extending this time of airing reality shows, while public interest media, as a sign of professionalism, introduce a lot of new programs that show different parts of society. So there is, my point is that there is, in this polarized media world, there is a different approach to show diversity of the society to the audiences, and it attracts different audiences. I think the diversity is the question of professionalism, and there are many indicators that journalists in this public interest media understand the significance of diversity, and they are improving. Every month you can see improving in offering diverse contents showing diverse people in the society and diverse interests and opinions.
Reality shows. Can we try once more, please? I feel really bad. I really feel bad. I mean, he was really looking forward to be with us, and then he couldn't come. Then he prepared. So let's see, and then we can open the floor for questions. Well, we discussed that. Say more than "Can you hear me?" and then we'll.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I just wanted to. I'm not no time to get into anything.
Optimism wins.
I can only say two things in this very short time. Okay. So one is the idea of pan-European platforms, because I think the American model, which is very driven by private interest, cannot inherently be compatible with any sort of public interest media. You can't really expect Facebook or Twitter to care about harmony in the society, peace in the society, diversity, and that kind of stuff. I mean, they may try their best, but ultimately it's the profit that speaks. So the idea of, I think the idea could work in Europe much better than in the US. So that's why I wrote a piece a couple of years ago, actually, in The Guardian about a European news platform that could start from existing platforms such as
if we
can you hear me?
maybe turn off the camera. If we can't hear you, then that's it. We'll bring you to the next Perugia festival.
No.
There you go.
What?
Can you?
What? Can you hear me? I was.
Unfortunately, no. Yeah? No. Sorry, Hossein. We're really sorry. Shall we open the floor? You all know already the rules, like there is no microphone, so if anyone wants to join this conversation, ask the questions, please try to be as short as possible so that we can repeat your comment and question via microphone for the streaming purposes.
No diversity in the room. Everyone is in complete
Everyone
agreement.
is-
Or complete disagreements, I don't know.
Everyone is optimistic. There is one. So how do we know what our audience really thinks and needs? Do we know that? How do we know that? This was the question. Svetlana, who do you want to answer this question? Not Hossein. Not Hossein.
I can do it if you want, yeah.
Yeah, Sharon, please.
I can do it. I mean, I think you're absolutely right, knowing your audience, and there's a lot of audience analytics are incredibly important. We did a study a couple of years ago which showed, people do have access to analytics, but aren't necessarily looking at it. And oftentimes it's simply just looking at page views and not looking at and trying to understand more. So I think there's two things: is what is the audience that you have? It becomes a chicken and egg, right? What audience do I have, and so what are their needs? And then there's also what audience do you want to reach, who maybe is not showing up in your analytics, and that's where I think we get into these filter bubbles a little bit again too. I want to reach the people who are already reading me. I want to expand that, so I'm expanding to that same like-minded group, as opposed to what do I need to do to reach beyond that. And I think that's where the challenge is, because your own analytics are not going to tell you that. So I think this is where there is partnerships that do need to be involved between news organizations and research organizations, for example. Who is not being reached, right? Well, and so I think that those kinds of partnerships are really important. A little bit what I was talking before about, I think there needs to actually be a lot more integration between the two. Like, there's studies and studies, and they wind up in a drawer. So I think those are the two things. It's what do I do to cater to it? So your audience analytics can tell you a lot, but it's not going to tell you who's beyond. And I think that is one challenge with the membership model, going back to the money, where it all starts, is in the membership model, you tend to sort of look at that first group, right? Who is going to donate to me? And that is, as advertising has gone like this, and digital advertising has completely dried up, the membership model is so important for both nonprofit and for-profit media. So I think there's a danger there too of looking at that sort of really core and not looking more broadly. So this to me is an opportunity for media to team up as well, and this is an opportunity for collaboration. it's a competitive business, but I think this is where if there's collaboration and you bring in other media organizations and research groups to help identify who are you not reaching, who is that persuadable piece, and then trying to figure out ways to what I talked about before, how do you sort of take the different pieces together? So I'm not sure if that's untheoretical or not for you, but that to me is the challenge.
Sharon, I'll take this as your final say. Peter, final word, and we have to close it. I'm having signs there.
Okay.
Optimistic.
Just on trusting, I wanted to answer. Look, we can talk about 1,000,001 methodologies of how you test this. Some of them are cheap, some of them are expensive. It does come down to money as well. But ours certainly don't end up in a drawer. They're on our website if you want to go and visit, arenaresearch.org. So that's that. But if we're looking for one, key thought, usually trust, or what we call trust, appears when people collaborate, when they work together. If any of you have ever been on one of these god-awful weekends that you get sent on to build team spirit in a corporation, I'm sorry that you've had to go through this, but they will get you to work together, to do things together, and lo and behold, it builds relationships that are trusting. And media, I think, need to plow into this direction. And I think the whole movement towards social journalism, there's a great, Jeff Jarvis has a whole, faculty dedicated to this at CUNY, is a really important movement. We've been doing a lot of work into conspiracy theories. Why do people believe conspiratorial mindsets? It's connected to powerlessness. So what's media's role in making people not feel more empowered, but be more empowered? Now, that is a sea change for many media who see themselves as beacons of truth who beam down. So again, I'm not against the beaming down. I'm not saying we destroy the old. I'm just saying we need some new as well. We can destroy some of the old, actually. But I do think we need a new movement that thinks about itself, media, as a social service in many, many levels, from really practical things to really deep therapeutic things. Again, that's a completely different mentality, especially in this very purist bit of media, which believes in, I think, a myth about the marketplace of ideas, that you just get the truth out there, and the powerful will be frightened of it, and the good people will treat it like manna from heaven. This is a semi-religious mythology that we have, backed up by zero evidence, and we have our own myths that we live in, which we probably need to examine.
Jovanka, how can we destroy everything old in the Balkans and bring new things?
I would say that the media today know about their audiences more than ever before. So that's a big change. The problem here is that you accept, if you are followed in your production orientation only by those who are active in answering and commenting your production, you are on a wrong way. There are a lot of people who use the media, use the content that is very important for their lives, but they never tell the media that they are doing that. So the reaction that you get from audiences owing to these new technologies is only one source of information that you should take into account. So we are going into a better future where the audiences will have better cooperation with the media. And as I insisted previously, I think it is important that the media users become active users and not only passive consumers.
Thank you. Jovanka, let me thank you for being with us. I'm really sorry we couldn't hear Hossein. Thank you for really creative and optimistic contributions. And I really want to believe that this new fund, this public interest media, when they apply for funding, that one of the criteria would be how you are going to reach the others, those who are not right now in the media. Thank you and see you.